7 years after the war, Britain was beginning to show signs of economic recovery. The Labour government had kept to its programme of nationalisation and welfare legislation. The election of a Conservative government in 1951 brought about a complete change in direction. According to their pre-election promises, the emphasis was to be on individual prosperity and more consumer goods in the shops. Where transport was concerned, this held out the promise of more private cars.
Once again, Earl's Court houses Britain's annual motor show. And if your pocket won't stretch this far, well, accent this year is on the family man's car. The Standard 8 is one of the new babies designed for the man with the not-so-hefty bank balance. Now for a glimpse of the cheapest of them all, the Ford Popular, a lively 10-horse job that costs £390 all in. On to the Morris Minor Traveller's Car, a shooting brake adaptation of the Popular runabout. Recognize the driver? It's Everest conqueror Sir Edmund Hillary trying the new Rover with his wife. Yes, the Jaguar, one of the sleekest speedsters in the show.
In 1950, petrol had finally come off the ration, and there was an immediate upsurge in car ownership for those who could afford it. But for the vast majority, public transport was the only means of getting about. This was often a miserable experience. There weren't enough buses or trains. Raw materials were still in short supply, and the export drive had priority over building buses. In 1953, the Conservatives brought in a Transport Act, which effectively dismantled the organisation set up by the previous government. London transport was detached from the Commission. Road transport was sold off, leaving only a skeleton administration to tidy up its affairs. Hotels ceased to be an independent entity. Railways and waterways were absorbed into the British Transport Commission, which, although retaining its name, completely changed its character. It lost its special role as director of a unified system and became instead the manager of the railways and waterways. As waterways were a small concern, the British Transport Commission came to mean railway management. Its objective to integrate transport was removed, and competition was to be the keynote.
The Act specifically dropped the obligation on the Commission to integrate transport. It simply said that they had to do various things, provide railway services for Great Britain. It didn't say what sort of services, and to do other things like running London transport, running ports and canals and so forth.
In London, buses, tubes and railways badly needed integrating. A standardised fare structure would have been a start, but under the new Act, plans of this kind were shelved. Canals could have played an important part in the national transport network. There were 2,000 miles of them in Britain in need of attention. With investment, many routes could have been modernised to carry bulk freight economically. Some improvements were begun, but they were wasted when canals ceased to be part of a plan for overall freight carriage. For road haulage, the story was very different. In the 3 years since nationalisation, 3,000 separate haulage companies were taken over and woven into a single undertaking, British Road Services. Most of the old vehicles were re-equipped or replaced. The new industry was successful, but the Conservatives, who were closely identified with the former lorry owners, pledged themselves to denationalising road haulage. When the 1953 Act came into force, the new fleet of lorries was sold off at bargain prices, often to the operators who a few years earlier had received handsome compensation for their old ones. The denationalisation of road haulage cut short the plans for integration, which would have greatly extended the service proudly offered by the railway companies before nationalisation.
But once more, the railway takes command. And now we can see the last link in this nationwide LMS chain, which has brought raw materials to warehouse and factory. For now, the railway's own vans speed the goods to the stores.
The major effects of the 53 Act were to destroy integration and to ensure that railways would cease to be the backbone of the transport system. The railways had always felt handicapped by the legal obligation to carry anything their customers required. But throughout their history, they had not been allowed to set their own charges. They had to carry all sorts of unprofitable consignments, alongside the more profitable ones like mail. It wasn't until the early 60s that the railways were allowed to fix their own charges and select the freight they carried. But in the meantime, the railways were still trying to run a service with broken-down equipment on worn-out track. Steam trains were expensive to run, and some of the equipment dated from Victorian times and was costly to maintain. Although still one big concern, the railways were given a structure of management which harked back to the era of the big four groups. The network was divided into 6 regions, and a great deal of autonomy was given to these new regional boards. But the real problems of the railways could not be solved by reorganization. The overriding need was for investment. It was not an inspiring time to be working on the railways. The network was probably in a worse state than it had been at the end of the war.
The railway's position was getting rather difficult in 1954. Traffics were falling, costs were rising, and the government asked Sir Brian Robertson, you know, the great chairman who had succeeded Lord Hurcomb, what he was going to do about it. And he thought very hard for a bit, and then he came up with what seemed a very good answer. Greater efficiency through modernisation and substantial investment. And that went down very well with the government. He was asked what sort of investment, how much, and over how long a period. And he came back and he instructed his officers to get out a plan very quickly, which they did, for spending £1,200 million over 15 years, and he outlined the main areas in which the investment would go, like electrification, diesel traction, new signalling methods, getting rid of all the old loose-coupled wagons with handbrakes and so forth. And it all looked rather good. And this was put to the government, and I think it's fair to say the Commission were a bit astonished with at the speed with which it was accepted.
An extensive program of electrification was part of the package. This would take the railways out of the Dark Ages and bring them into line with many continental countries. England lagged behind, even though the first experimental line was introduced in the 1880s in Brighton, and by the beginning of the 20th century, several projects got underway. Work in the South London suburbs began in 1909. The London and South Western Railway was one of the pioneers that adopted the 660-volt third rail system, as did the South Eastern and Chatham. The southern commuters travelled in great comfort with the speed and smoke-free atmosphere that electric traction provided. In the 1950s, British Rail adopted the overhead 25,000-volt AC system that had been pioneered in France. The fact that permission was granted for an ambitious scheme which included electrification was due partly to the persuasive personality of the chairman of the British Transport Commission, Sir Brian Robertson. He managed to convince a government hostile to the railways to invest in the modernisation plan.
It reveals our faith in electrification. On all parts of the system where the density of traffic justifies the considerable initial capital expenditure, we are quite sure that electrification gives the best answer and, in the end, the best railway.
But in 1958, the railways were still operating over 16,000 steam engines, and complete electrification was never part of the plan. Diesel was to play a major role in the modernisation of the railways. The prototype of this was developed by the LMS and made its first appearance in 1947, just before nationalisation. There were many experimental types of diesel locomotives. This one looks as though it would have been happier as a steam engine. The Blue Pullman was introduced in 1960, the product of the modernisation plan. It was a forerunner of today's high-speed 125 trains. The Deltic was the most impressive of the new diesels. It was the most powerful locomotive in the world. The Deltic hauled the first train to have a scheduled speed of 100 miles an hour. Diesel had been adopted as the main type of power because it required lower capital investment than electrification. Fuel oil was cheap then, but the diesel program was badly conceived. Operation and maintenance was jeopardized by the government's insistence that contracts went to a variety of private firms rather than to the railway's own workshops. There was little continuity or standardization, and a wide range of locomotives were produced, many of which proved unreliable and were scrapped. The railways were also bringing their freight handling methods up to date. The old methods of marshalling goods were laborious, time-consuming, and very dangerous. Workers had to run alongside the wagons and apply the brakes. Many were seriously injured in shunting accidents. Some even lost their lives. Under the modernisation plan, vast new marshalling yards were being built, such as this one at Tinsley near Sheffield. In marshalling yards, wagons are shunted over a hump, uncoupled, and then allowed to descend into the correct sidings. The real breakthrough in the new yards was a system of hydraulic jacks, which could accelerate and retard wagons automatically, so that they wouldn't crash into those already in the sidings. The jacks reduced damage to both the goods in the railway wagons and to the wagons themselves. They also reduced shunting accidents. Although the technology was excellent, the building of marshalling yards on this scale proved to be a mistake. Within 10 years, handling methods changed, and the yards were never fully utilized. Most of the old goods yards, where the freight ended its journey, were built in Victorian times, when the main traffic on the roads was horses and carts. But these yards were crowded and cramped. Under the modernisation plan, new goods depots were built with plenty of space for vehicles, and mechanisation of goods handling was introduced. The passengers also gained. Here at Manchester's Oxford Road, the station was entirely rebuilt in the 1960s. The laminated wood frame was an innovation developed from a technique used in wartime aircraft. British Railways also refitted the interior of railway stations, and automation even extended to the buffets. Money was spent on the small stations as well as the large ones. The aim was to make railway travelling pleasanter at all stages of the journey. Victorian signal boxes were to go under the plan. In the new boxes, staff could supervise trains that were out of sight and therefore manage a much larger area from one control point. New developments in track were introduced. The new concrete sleepers were temporarily held together with 20-foot length rail. These were then levered out, and 600-foot lengths of continuously welded rail were rolled into position on rubber cushions. The railways were rightly proud of their achievement.
Here it is, firm and safe, the 100-mile-an-hour track of the future. A permanent way, never before so permanent.
The London-Birmingham motorway, first of its kind in Britain, will open for traffic on November the 2nd, barring unforeseen delays. It's many wonders.
The railway's modernisation plan was eclipsed by the motorway building programme. The M1 was the start of the government's commitment to major road building. The spending on roads made the spending on rail look trivial. By the end of the 50s, transport policies were becoming synonymous with the road building programme. The government had clearly decided that the future lay with the car.
The biggest advantage which the motor industry seemed to offer governments in the 50s was the possibility of growth and the possibility of an expanding employment base. This is particularly important given that we are now on the verge of what were to be quite dramatic rundowns in employment in what was known as the traditional industries, coal industry in particular, which lost 300,000 jobs in the 60s. And what the car industry offered was, one, a flexible base of expanded employment, and two, the possibility of developing large numbers of exports and thereby a steady balance of payments. And so the economic advantages of the industry were quite central in the minds of successive governments and were equally pushed by the car companies.
A powerful lobby grew up in the car industry, which had a strong influence on government policy.
The elements in this lobby are, first of all, the car companies themselves and the organisation which links them together, which is called the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders. And they linked up with something which is called the Road Haulage Association, which caters for the interests of the companies that own lorry fleets. And these two together consistently petitioned Parliament, consistently worked within the Ministry of Transport, consistently argued the case for the kind of society they wanted to build based around the internal combustion engine and the car and the lorry. The other part of that lobby, and maybe it's less of an intentional part, and it's a paradoxical one, is found in the trade union movement itself. Because the rundown of the industries I've mentioned also mirrors an important change in the power balance within the trade union movement itself. The expansion of motor manufacturing saw the expansion of a number of unions, but most centrally the Transport and General Workers Union. I mean, that union organised many numbers of assembly line workers in the car plants. It also organised, and perhaps more importantly, the lorry drivers. And in the middle 50s, that lorry drivers group was the most strong group within the Transport and General Workers Union. What comes in with the car in an important way is the development of mass consumption. And one of the elements in the program which the companies developed to sell their motor cars is very clearly an element which indicates that the car offers a new way of life, a new style of living, a new notion of freedom. And those three elements are used in open contrast to the restricted life of the pre-war period. Well, as more and more cars became produced and sold, of course, these millions and millions of cars had to go onto the roads and run. And one of the big problems which emerged in the late 50s and which took an edge a bit off the pleasure was, in fact, the traffic jam. And that was, in fact, one of the most graphic images of this time. It's an image which became seen on that other part of societal change, the television. But it was also experienced by motorists as they spent their weekends away, sat with many hundreds of others waiting in line for the cars to move on. And that problem of congestion, I think, highlights this way in which mass production of cars has to be seen at the level of a society. if you're going to produce cars and sell them, you really have to change the fabric of a society. And in this period, the motor companies were pushing very, very strongly for a solution to the problem of congestion to be won through the building of roads.
The new road building programme, which started with construction costs at around £300,000 a mile, was within the decade to escalate to £1 million a mile. The motorways were changing the landscape in a way unknown since the railways appeared. But by now land was even scarcer, and the motorways required even wider corridors. When one ran through the town, the financial cost could be high, but the human cost incalculable. Within the Ministry of Transport, however, road building was regarded as the way forward, and railways were viewed as a bit of an anachronism. Not much notice was taken of the railway's efforts to modernise. The phasing out of steam was of interest mainly to the steam enthusiasts. The spending on the modernisation programme was increasingly under attack.
The cost didn't go up all that much, from 1,200 millions to 1,500 millions. When we think of the sort of escalation of costs that we're used to nowadays, it was relatively modest. But there were certainly some people in the ministry who were a bit sceptical about the plan, and they pressed for it to be re-examined rather closely.
The minister ordered a new look at the modernisation plan and called a halt on further spending. The timing of the cutbacks led to enormous waste. In order to electrify, bridges had to be raised. In many cases, this costly work had already been done when the money was stopped. The cable wasn't installed, and the job never completed. There were many other examples where the benefits of investment were never realised because a project was frozen halfway through. The cutback in the modernisation plan came at a crucial time. The economy was picking up, and the demand for transport was growing. The railways had been developing to meet the challenge, but with reduced resources, the pace of change slowed down. The improvements already completed were not enough to reverse the impression that railways were out of date and uncomfortable. The aspiration of ordinary people became to buy a car. Although the majority of the population did not and still do not own a car, public transport was marginalised. The new motorways came to represent progress.
The opening of M1 was great news, and the new Minister of Transport, Mr. Ernest Marples, was there to open it.
Now, sir, this motorway starts a new era in road travel. It is in keeping with the bold, exciting, and scientific age in which we live. Now, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I declare the road open.
Marples, one of Harold Macmillan's self-made men, moved to transport in 1959. He was an ardent believer in conservative philosophy, which he promoted along with his own image. His brash showbiz style was ever to the fore. During the 1951 election, he arrived at the polls in a chariot. Another stunt was his cycle ride for the press while Minister of Transport, enhancing his image as the common man. His prejudice for motorway building stemmed from his earlier career in civil engineering. He was very much involved in the Hammersmith flyover project. The company which got the contract was his very own, Marples Ridgeway. In 1959, with the road building programme underway, Marples set about studying the railways. He had recently received a government report on nationalised industries which made no fundamental criticism of the structure of the railways. This didn't suit Marples. He set up his own inquiry into the railways, which produced the results he wanted. The role of the railways should be reduced. He then had to find someone to carry out the reorganisation. He chose his friend, the technical director of ICI, Dr. Richard Beeching.
There's a Channel 4 book entitled Losing Track by Kerry Hamilton and Stephen Potter, available from bookshops, price £7.95 paperback.